Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
This week on the podcast, we're going to talk about mandalas. Now, mandalas have permeated the popular culture to a certain extent. I think I have perhaps more than one mandala coloring book. But they were important to Jung, and of course, they are very, very ancient. This came up for me recently when I was at the British Museum and saw some incredible artwork of some mandalas, some ancient mandalas that were created that are there in the museum. So it inspired me to have us talk about this kind of important idea that Jung spent a lot of time thinking and writing about.
So, like a lot of Sanskrit words, they're very plain speak. Chakra, for instance, that many people know means wheel. Mandala means circle. Very descriptive, very direct. So as part of the ancient spiritual tradition, and our first evidence of this seems to be from the Vedas, that there are descriptions of these kind of symbols that are used to help people develop. Mandala, just in terms of observation, is a circle often with various kinds of images that are artistically rendered inside of the circle. It's used in a lot of different ways. One tradition is entering into the mandala, a little bit like a map, navigating through it where you would then encounter deities, for instance, like an active imagination, using a mantra or various kinds of religious text. You develop a relationship with the archetype. Hopefully, if that activates, it stimulates a certain kind of spiritual development inside of us. It's an ancient method. Many different traditions use it. In the Christian tradition, some people use the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, where we go into active imagination. So the mandala is an ancient symbol that was used in that way and in many other ways. And important for our purposes is that Jung took a real interest in mandalas and had a very powerful transformative experience in a very dark time of his own life.
So maybe we will frame that by just bringing that up. So I'm going to be reading from his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I'm going to read a little bit. It was only toward the end of the First World War that I gradually began to emerge from the darkness. Two events contributed to this. The first was that I broke with a woman who was determined to convince me that my fantasies had artistic value. The second and principal event was that I began to understand mandala drawings. This happened in 1918 through 1919. I had painted the first mandala in 1916 after writing the Septem Sermones. Naturally, I had not then understood it. In 1918 and 1919, I was in the Château d'Aix as commandant de la Région Anglaise des Internés de Guerre. While I was there, I sketched every morning in a notebook a small circular drawing, a mandala which seemed to correspond to my inner situation at the time. With the help of these drawings, I could observe my psychic transformations from day to day. My mandalas were cryptograms concerning the state of the self, which were presented to me anew each day. In them, I saw the self, that is, my whole being, actively at work. To be sure, at first I could only dimly understand them, but they seemed to me highly significant, and I guarded them like precious pearls. I had the distinct feeling that they were something central, and in time I acquired through them a living conception of the self. The self, I thought, was like the monad, which I am, and which is my world. The mandala represents this monad and corresponds to the microcosmic nature of the psyche. And I will say that that's one of the things that caught me about some of the mandalas that I saw in the British Museum is that mandalas are supposed to be a microcosm of the cosmos. They're a little picture of the whole world, of the whole cosmos. And so there's there's this as above, so below thing going on. We ourselves, Jung is saying, our psyche is a microcosm of the cosmos as well. And both of these things can be imaged by the mandala.
I think that such an important and central idea that's emerged from Jungian work is we need some kind of cosmology. We need a way of imagining the universe in such a way that we are part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So we might have a mathematical understanding of the physics or astrophysics of the universe. All of it may be very scientifically accurate, but we need to find a way for our imagination to create a bridge between Lisa and I sitting here having a chat and what is happening at the level of the infinite. So
that's great.
Mandalas, the gods are all drinking tea, apparently. And maybe they are. But this way of imagining the universe allows these archetypal forces to have a relationship to us that is titrated. And that allows us to make the best use of that strata of the unconscious or the collective unconscious. So, just as Lisa was reading from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Jung discovered himself drawing these circles. He had already been widely read in terms of various kinds of anthropologic resources. And in the 1940s, Europe was still the inheritor of these vast archaeologic digs that they were leading in the ancient world and in Asia. And this material that was being discovered was being sent for analysis over to Europe. And Jung and other scholars finally had access to remarkable information. The Secret of the Golden Flower was an ancient, or is an ancient Chinese treatise that Jung was able to find a translation of, and it had a radical effect on him and his understanding of that archetypal layer of the psyche. So the mandala is a circle, and depending on the tradition, it will be arranged imagistically to bring forward different elements of it. I'm going to read a little section from the collected works where he also talks about mandalas because he's particularly talking about an encounter he had watching a woman creating a mandala and how he was thinking to himself about it. He writes, "The Sanskrit word mandala means circle. In the Indian term for the circles drawn in religious rituals. In the great temple of Madura in southern India, I saw how a picture of this kind was made. It was drawn by a woman on the floor of the mandampam, which means porch, in colored chalks, and measured about 10 feet across. A pundit who accompanied me said in reply to my questions that he could give me no information about it. Only the woman who drew such pictures knew what they meant. The woman herself was non-committal. She evidently did not want to be disturbed in her work. Elaborate mandalas, executed in red chalk, can also be found on the whitewashed walls of many huts. The best and most significant mandalas are found in the sphere of Tibetan Buddhism. And I shall use as an example a Tibetan mandala to which my attention was drawn by Richard Wilhelm. A mandala of this sort is known in ritual usage as a yantra, an instrument of contemplation. It is meant to aid concentration by narrowing down the psychic field of vision and restricting it to the center. Usually, the mandala contains 3 circles painted in black or dark blue. They are meant to shut out the outside and hold the inside together. Almost regularly, the outer rim consists of fire, the fire of desire, from which proceed the torments of hell. The horrors of the burial ground are generally depicted on the outer rim. Inside this is a garland of lotus leaves, characterizing the whole mandala as a padma, or lotus flower. Then comes a kind of monastery courtyard with 4 gates. It signifies sacred seclusion and concentration. Inside this courtyard, there are, as a rule, 4 basic colors: red, green, white, and yellow, which represent the 4 directions and also the psychic functions, as the Tibetan Book of the Dead shows. Then, usually marked off by another magic circle, comes the center as the essential object or goal of contemplation. This center is treated in very different ways depending on the requirements of the ritual, the grade of initiation of the contemplator, and the sect he belongs to. As a rule, it shows Shiva in his world-creating emanations. Shiva, according to Tantric doctrine, is the one existent, the timeless in its perfect state. Creation begins when this unextended point, known as Shiva Bindu, appears in the eternal embrace of its feminine side, the Shakti. It then emerges from this state of being in itself and attains the state of being for itself. Lots of stuff packed into that.
It's so helpful to hear him kind of describe these traditional mandalas and to kind of get a sense of his own scholarship around it and his own, kind of personal experience with his trip to India. But it's also worth pointing out that for him, the drawing of the mandalas began completely spontaneously. And what he tells us, and I suppose I have just a small grain of salt about this, which I'll explain in a second, is that mandalas arise spontaneously for everyone. So he has analyzans coming in, and they're bringing in mandalas in their dreams, and they're bringing in mandalas in their active imaginations. And my one little bit of cynicism is that we know that Jungian patients bring in Jungian dreams. And I suspect that anyone in a Jungian analysis is likely to bring in a mandala because unconsciously we know that's kind of expected of us. But he finds this, and I think it's substantially true. I mean, this image of the circle or the squared circle appears again and again and again throughout religion. I mean, when you were reading that, Joseph, I was thinking about the Native American medicine wheel, which is another kind of mandala. Thinking about a lot of Christian churches will have a labyrinth. Walking the labyrinth is kind of that process of contemplation that you were describing, and it's a journey into the center, just as it is with the mandala. So certainly the squared circle, the circle as an image of the world, the circle as an image of the cosmos, the circle as an image of totality is certainly a powerful, powerful archetypal image.
Adding to that, clinically, Jung came to understand that the mandala will constellate in dreams or very powerfully in the imagination as a way to address certain things. So he writes in another section, as psychological phenomena, Mandalas appear spontaneously in dreams during certain states of conflict and in cases of schizophrenia. Very frequently, they contain a quaternity or a multiple of 4. So, one of the things that Jung was noticing is that the mandala comes as a way of addressing a chaotic internal state. That we have a profound impulse to thrive. And when something is interfering with that and we become disordered, psychologically disordered, to such an extent that we may be vulnerable in profound ways, something deep, the self, tries to save us, tries to keep us safe. And one of the ways it will do that is by activating mandala energy. And as that energy grows and activates, it brings forward images to carry that into the realm of consciousness. And mandala symbolism is one of the ways that medicine is delivered.
So to kind of elaborate on that, Jung says in that same essay, he says that mandalas serve to produce an inner order. So the purpose, he would say, the telos of drawing those mandalas for him was to try to make order out of the chaos of his psyche. And this, of course, would be an example of the self-regulating function of the psyche, which Jung believed that the psyche is self-regulating. When we get out of balance, we do things to try to heal it. And one of the ways that we can get out of balance, of course, is in psychosis. So he mentioned, as you were saying, Joseph, that the creation, kind of the activation of the mandala energy can be an effort to heal ourselves. Well, the Jungian analyst John Weir Perry took that up in his studies of psychosis. I'm going to be reading right now from his book, The Far Side of Madness, which is fascinating.
It is.
But he gives some examples of patients, psychotic patients, so patients we would probably think of as having schizophrenia, who generated these mandala-like images of the squared circle. So I'm going to read just a little bit of one. So he's talking about this person that he was working with. The individual drew with crayons during some of his interviews, making many representations of the quadrated circle in conjunction with his stories of kings, victors, and saviors. So here is one of the patient's descriptions of his kind of psychotic image that he perhaps drew. The Garden of Paradise, with its Trinity and Devil, and the kings of the 4 directions, were instances of this arrangement of space. The crown of Prince Valiant consisted of a cube surmounted by a sphere from which sprang a radiation of 7 stars or jewels on gold streamers. The breastplate of King Richard had concentric circles quadrated by 2 crossed swords, with signs indicating the club of 300 youths who went to their sacrificial deaths in war. A variant on this was a shield of concentric hearts quadrated by crossed swords. And Perry goes on to say, among the parallels from the sacral kingship of archaic times is the emphasis upon a world center or cosmic axis, a position of most intense and concentrated potency for creativeness, both in the sense of giving of life and the giving of order. This was typically the ritual locus of at least the king god, if not of the king himself. This mythological image of the center was the location of a focus of power and governance, with a structuring of a sacred space around it in the form of a quadrated circle, the origin of the mandala. This surrounding structure was at one and the same time a cosmos, world, kingdom, temple, and throne room in times when the archaic mythological mentality perceived these as sharing in the same nature and pattern. So according to Jung and Perry, what happens when we fall apart in psychosis is the psyche attempts to heal itself by constellating this archetypal image of wholeness, of the cosmos, of the center, which is expressed in the image of the mandala.
Lots of rich thought in all of that.
I know it's a little arcane, but
not arcane, beautiful and meaningful. And this is the aesthetic way that Jung and Jungians hold the sacredness of symbols that can transform, and particularly with the mandala, symbols that can save us.
Oh, that's great, Joseph. I'm really glad you brought that in because we had a question about that recently. I think it was from one of our listeners, like what is the big deal with this symbol and how does it save us? And here is this way, at least for Jung, drawing these mandalas saved him at a dark time. They constituted a sense of wholeness.
He had been in excruciating pain. At this point in his life, he was sleeping with a pistol in the bedstand next to him, and he was talking to the unconscious, saying, if this doesn't resolve, I'm out of here. I am not going to live like this. And when he got to that terrible nadir, that excruciating suicidal intensity, he dreamt of a mandala that he had seen in a town square in Liverpool, which changed the course of his process and allowed his personality, which had been fragmenting apparently, to bring itself back together in a new way that not only resolved his pain, but also helped him synthesize a massive amount of unconscious material that he didn't know what to do with. And having, over time, that opportunity to synthesize it, it allowed him to bring forward an entirely new way of conceptualizing his own and other people's psychology. And we are the great receivers of this amazing information.
Would it make sense to share this Liverpool dream, this mandala dream? I think it would be good because
puts it in real life.
Right. I think it shows you what he's talking about. It's such a beautiful dream. So this is Jung's dream. He had it in 1927. I found myself in a dirty, sooty city. It was night and winter and dark and raining. I was in Liverpool with a number of Swiss, say half a dozen. I walked through the dark streets. I had the feeling that there we were coming from the harbor and that the real city was actually up above on the cliffs. We climbed up there. It reminded me of Basel, where the market is down below and then you go up through the Tottengassen, the Alley of the Dead, which leads to the plateau above, and so to the Petersplatz and the Peterskirche. When we reached the plateau, we found a broad square dimly illuminated by streetlights into which many streets converged. The various quarters of the city were arranged radially around the square. And in the center was a round pool, and in the middle of it, a small island. While everything round about was obscured by rain, fog, and smoke, dimly lit darkness, the little island blazed with sunlight. On it stood a single tree, a magnolia in a shower of reddish blossoms. It was as though the tree stood in the sunlight and were at the same time the source of light. My companions commented on the abominable weather and obviously did not see the tree. They spoke of another Swiss who was living in Liverpool and expressed surprise that he should have settled here. I was carried away by the beauty of the flowering tree and the sunlit island and thought, I know very well why he has settled here. And he goes on to say, the dream represented my situation at the time. I can still see the grayish-yellow raincoats glistening with the wetness of the rain. Everything was extremely unpleasant, black and opaque, just as I felt then. But I had had a vision of unearthly beauty, and that was why I was able to live at all. Liverpool is the pool of life. The liver, according to an old view, is the seat of life, that which makes to live. This dream brought with it a sense of finality. I saw that here, the goal had been revealed. One could not go beyond the center. The center is the goal, and everything is directed toward that center. Through this dream, I understood that the self is the principle and archetype of orientation and meaning. Therein lies its healing function. So it's not that he had this dream of sort of a a round drawing like you see in, ancient Tibetan pictures. But there it was, this image of a square with a circle and things radiating out from it. And there in the center of the circle was this vision of unearthly beauty. So very, very much a mandala image.
It speaks to the way in which the dream maker so generously beckons us, because it could have been a circle that was boring or like a blob of dirt, in the middle of the water, and he would have just walked past it, so to speak. But the fact that the dream maker so generously made that island and the luminous tree so appealing, so fascinating, he couldn't take his eyes off it, was a way of really tethering him to the medicine in that dream. And he woke and felt it, apparently, and was able to set aside the despair and agony and to have some trust that there is an intelligence that is guiding this process. And that was a rather new idea. Psychologists weren't thinking that way when he had that dream or when he was formulating his concepts.
So the mandala in Jungian thought has a couple of very important connections. The first is that I think you'll hear is his notion of the self. And he says that dream of this kind of mandala-like configuration in Liverpool was kind of his intimation of the self. This is where he began to articulate this idea that we have a center, we have a kind of inner microcosm that is whole, and that we can find our way towards, and he called that the self. And also, the fact that mandalas appear in all of these different cultures, across time, they arise spontaneously from the psyches of individuals who are psychotic or struggling. And Jung said, there must be a trans-conscious disposition in every individual which is able to produce the same or very similar symbols at all times and places. And this he names the collective unconscious. So it's partly by seeing these iterations of this similar symbol across many different cultures and arising again spontaneously from the psyches of individuals that he says, what's going on there? This is the kind of big idea about the collective unconscious is what we're talking about right here, is that you at night might go to sleep and spontaneously dream a mandala image. And it might have for you a very similar feeling sense as Jung's Liverpool dream or the sand paintings that a Tibetan monk might make. That there's something numinous about this. Even if we don't understand it rationally, it speaks to us and our need for wholeness.
Now, when we use the example of Jung having a dark night of the soul, wondering if he can survive the process he's going through, we can come away thinking, oh, well, this must be a very special, strange kind of appearance. But actually, in other places, Jung says, no. He says, as a rule, a mandala appears in conditions of psychic dissociation or disorientation. For instance, he writes, in children between the ages of 8 and 11 whose parents are divorcing, or adults who, as a result of neuroses or its treatment, are confronted with the problem of opposites in human nature causing disorientation. So those are not life-threatening situations, but the individual, whether it's a child or an adult, doesn't know where to stand in relationship to enormous changes that are going on in their world, like a divorce, or we might even imagine getting fired, or some of us have kids that graduate from college and then they kind of just crump. When they come home, they just don't know what to do yet. They're not oriented to the next stage. And if we're paying attention, or they're paying attention, we may notice these circular representations just showing up, and they might show up in very ordinary ways. I remember an analysand I had many years ago, and I didn't catch this at the time, but they were telling me a dream, and the dream had a bunch of action in it. And I was asking them to describe the setting, and in an off-handed way, they said, oh yeah, there was this strange wallpaper all over the place, just circles everywhere. Maybe they were bubbles. And I just noted it, but we talked about everything else that was going on in the room, but I didn't think until a long time afterwards, like the whole room was full of mandalas that were playing a role in orienting this person to what's coming next and getting their feet on the ground in very practical and pragmatic ways.
Joseph, I like what you said about, kind of like just at various times of life transition, this might arise for us as kind of an orienting principle. But I think underneath that is that beautiful thing that you said a few minutes ago about we need to have a kind of cosmological view. We need to have a relationship with the cosmos at some level. We need to have some way of understanding how we fit into the cosmos. And in a sense, that is what the mandala offers us, is here is the microcosm, and we belong to it. And it is within us in some sense too, and it also arises from us. So just want to go back to Jung for 1 second and this lovely quote. As I have said, mandala means circle. There are innumerable variants in the motifs shown here, but they are all based on the squaring of a circle. Their basic motif is the premonition of the center of the personality, a kind of central point within the psyche by which everything is arranged and which is itself a source of energy. The energy of the central point is manifested in the almost irresistible compulsion and urge to become what one is, just as every organism is driven to assume the form that is characteristic of its nature, no matter what the circumstances. The center is not felt or thought of as the ego, but, if one may so express it, as the self. So there, in that short segment, is a really beautiful description both of the self and also of individuation.
So these symbols create bridges between very big, powerful energies. Jung is trying to describe them using this very erudite language, which some people can feel alienated from. But I think if we relax into it, and maybe we just need to, Google the heck out of some of these terms, we find that he's talking about something that is intimately connected to all people. So here's another example of where mandalas show up. I, again, had another analysand, and she was talking about a very difficult childhood. And when she was a child, she would spend endless amounts of time twirling her hair. And that when that would happen as an adult, she was a very successful businesswoman, she would ponder it. And so we were talking a lot about self-soothing and all the reasonable stuff. But it broke upon me when she was doing it in the office that what she was doing was this, just drawing circles on her scalp over and over and over again. And it had a kind of medicinal energy. Yes, it was calming, but she was tracing a mandala on the side of her head over and over and over again. And when Jung had that Liverpool dream, he started every day just drawing little circles on pieces of paper to conjure the healing effects of the circle, of the magic circle, so to speak. Now, the idea of the magic circle shows up in a lot of different ways. You'll even see this in Hollywood. If you have some kind of an occult a film or a TV series, sooner or later, somebody's going to want to draw a circle of salt,
Right,
for instance,
right,
on the ground. And if you
right.
hop in the circle of salt, then the devilish things can't reach you. It's going to protect you. Why is it that we believe that? What is it about being in the center of a circle that protects you from the chaos of spiritual forces that seek to injure you? And it's this identification with the self, that when you're standing in the middle of the circle, it is a ritualistic declaration that I am one with a power that transcends all the circumstances of my life, spiritual or material. And there is great comfort, if nothing else, and perhaps even more serious benefits and boons that one has by identifying with it that way.
So we have a bunch of dreams in Dreamwise. I think our book Dreamwise has something like 160 sampled dreams in it, and one of them is perfect for this image of the mandala. So I'm going to share it with you. This is from the chapter on the self. I have a recurring dream of walking up a hill toward a little stone house overgrown with vines. I'm overcome with a deep sense of happiness, a sense of coming home. I know as I start up the hill that I will find an open door, and inside the interior will be a flood of golden light from leaded windows. My steps quicken. The room is exactly as I expect it to be. A wooden staircase is on the right, leading to a second story unseen from the outside. To the left is an archway leading into another room with gleaming wooden floors. Beyond that, another arch leading deeper into the interior. I walk from room to room, following a path that spirals as if I am walking through the coils of a shell. The deeper I go, the more sacred the space becomes. Sometimes there are other people with me, sometimes I am alone. As I reach the center of the shell, I find a circular room, the most sacred spot of all. I have to squeeze through the coils to get inside. The walls have turned to stone, and a light comes from all angles despite the tight space. I reach another door, and inside there is an altar, a black stone slab on which lies a petrified deer antler, a strange rock, and some curious silver statues, curled forms, neither male nor female. I sense a presence I can almost see, and then I wake up. So it's that journey into the center, that coiling, spiraling journey into the center where she finds this circular room with an altar.
It's beautiful. And that process of going from threshold to threshold, going down, the journey here and there is very much like being a member of our dream school, actually.
I knew you were going to work that in there somehow.
It was feel like a perfect opportunity. So let me just take a second that these dreams, which seem very magical but also very inscrutable, what do they mean? I don't live those kinds of experiences in my day-to-day life, so how do I put myself into these extraordinary images and extract something that's useful in a very practical way? And this is one of the goals that we have in Dream School, which is our online learning program. We have various modules which you can listen to as recorded material.
Mm-hmm.
If you're more of a reader, you can read the material. If you're a more relational person, we have live communities where people come together and form dream schools, as well as joining us because we present programming. Lisa does a monthly masterclass where she works with somebody on a dream in front of everybody in dream school so they get a sense of that kind of dialogue. I do a fireside chat, once a month, and I am prompted by questions and processes that people have shared with me and provide lectures on those topics. And Deb, her generous heart, she meets with people one-on-one. They schedule hours with her, and she spends a little bit of time with people so they can have a really individual touch to that process. So if this is interesting to you, and of course we hope that it is, join us in Dream School. and let us walk with you through these various thresholds. Let us be one of the many people you talk to as you spiral through these extraordinary sequences of images. And I can promise you that if you enter into dream school with the kind of sincerity that I know you must have, or else you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, there are secrets inside of you that are waiting to explain themselves to you. And these are the kinds of secrets that can change your life in rather remarkable, lovely ways. So go to our website, thisjungianlife.com, click on Dream School, look through it, and trust your heart as it talks to you about the opportunity.
Just to kind of follow up on that in a sense, Jung's collected works are filled with beautiful artwork from himself and from his analysans of their mandala-like creations that came up either in dreams or in active imagination. And of course, his red book is filled with this artwork, many of which are mandalas.
So coming full circle back to our treatment of mandalas, we can learn a couple of things from Jung. One, the circle is such a ubiquitous image. Like I look around the room, oh, there's a circular mirror, there's a clock, there's a quarter on the table there. They're everywhere we look. It can be so common that we forget how profound it actually is.
Yeah.
You look up in the night sky and you see the circular moon glowing and silvery. All of these spontaneous circles that we see are connected to a very deep layer of our own psychology, and particularly in dreams, to ask that one question, where are the circles in my dream?
Mm-hmm.
Which it may be something that you don't ask. Oh, there's a cup. That's a circle. That's a bit of a mandala, etc., etc. All the circles that we are contained in, all of the circles that we behold, if we were to try to see them as connected to that universal principle of oneness, that principle of us in relationship to the great mystery, could re-enchant our lives in a way that is remarkable and frankly is something that we as modern folks desperately need. We know everything about the pragmatics of our life. We know what it's like to clean the house and argue with a spouse and get our kids ready for school and get to work on time. And like, we've got that. We live that life. But where's the magic? And what I would suggest is the magic is contained in every circle that you encounter. And if you saw that, even just for a day, you might notice that there is magic around you. I'm looking over here out of a window on my porch. A mourning dove has built a little nest in a potted plant right outside the window. And when I look in the nest, it's a mandala.
Yeah.
It's a perfect circle with little circular eggs. I mean, the magic of the circle is everywhere.
So here's a question from Christina. And Christina shared her question as a voice memo. So let's listen to that now.
When I was in college going through a particularly hard time, I was sitting in my rhetoric class and suddenly the world in front of me disappeared and I was staring into an azure blue space, infinite space with eyes and flames and a wheel rotating in on itself. And just like it was there, it suddenly wasn't. And I was back in class. And so I drew down what I saw on my paper. Later, I showed my friend and he said, well, that's a mandala. And I said, a what? And he said, have you ever heard of the Tibetan wheel of life? And I said, no. And he said, have you ever heard of Carl Jung? And I said, no. And he said, you should look those two things up. And so I did. And it set me on a lifelong path of many things, definitely being a Carl Jung fan and avid reader. And so my question is, because when I work with students and I work with other artists and mandala related things, when you have a symmetrical mandala, um, and when you have kind of a mandala that has images that are just contained in a circle, kind of from the Jungian perspective, what is the difference between those two? And is there one that's better than the other, or how would you categorize them?
So I'll jump in and offer just a few ideas about the distinctions. So a mandala can be radically symmetrical, which is this kind of precise 4 or 8 part geometry, and things are very evenly balanced. The colors and the motifs are all very balanced. And how I would interpret that, let's say if I had that in a dream, that the whole design is the symbol, and that nothing distracts from the circular, centered order. And so the image, therefore, enacts the archetype of the self. So, as Jung would say, it's this principle of totality that unites whatever is otherwise irreconcilable. So, that kind of highly structured mandala usually constellates when there's something overwhelming going on. Maybe there's a kind of internal chaos, or there's a very radical one-sidedness, which is, by the way, how we all are when we're young. By the time we're in college, it's so much we don't know about ourselves. And so there's a lot of unconscious activation. So when we're in that kind of turbulence, the structured mandala becomes the axis around which your being must revolve. And so that kind of mandala supplies orientation and a momentary standstill so that a new integration can begin. The other, which is a more pictorial, or I guess I would call a narrative mandala. So there's figures and animals and scenes that are inside of the circle while the perimeter kind of encloses it. And then I would say in a dream that the circle functions as a vase, an alchemical vase, and it's a protecting circle. And so the emphasis shifts to the contents, which often can be even antagonistic pairs of opposites which are being held together. There could be mythic elements in it, personal complexes that are still demanding confrontation. So there's a lot of movement, but it is still being held, and that the self is assisting you in that. So I would interpret that second kind of mandala, that the ego is already capable of moving within the temenos, and that individuation has advanced from simply the mere possession of a center to a kind of slow dramatization and conscious assimilation of opposites. And the conflict may not be resolved, but it is being worked through within a kind of containment. Now, I'll toss it to you, Lisa. Is one better than the other?
No, I think they just represent different aspects, different parts of a process, really. I think that was beautiful, what you said, Joseph. I think the only thing that I want to comment on is her experience in college, which is, it goes to, this phenomenon that we've identified about this, that these images appear to us spontaneously out of the collective unconscious. So she has this incredible vision in the middle of her rhetoric class, and her friend says, yeah, that's the Tibetan wheel of life. That's the nature of the collective unconscious.
And what's so wonderful is that there is this intelligence inside of us that gives us this perfectly titrated little recipe of things that we need in a moment in time. So the symmetrical mandala is the fortress built of 4 worlds, and that's to resist disintegration. And the pictorial mandala is a vessel of transformation, where there's this fluidity that replaces the crystalline perfection.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. Beautiful experience. I have to say, I can understand why she would remember it so many years after.
So here's a comment from Karina, and Karina also left us a voice memo.
Good morning. Such a synchronicity. For about a week, I started drawing mandalas every morning. And while I was drawing this morning, I'm like, I should do a research if there are rules how to draw mandalas. So we need to do certain patterns, we need to do certain shapes, or it's just free association. And the second question, it's regarding interpretation. Do I have to think of any, or there is any interpretation in regards with mandalas? Thank you so much. And also, I want to thank you so much for the Dream School and in general for all the work you're doing. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Karina.
I love it when we get those little
I
sweet
know.
drive-by waves, you know.
Yeah. So what I would say about this is no, there are no rules about how to draw mandalas. I think that, Karina, you're feeling somehow called to draw them, which is exactly what happened to Jung. He didn't plan to do it. He just found himself doing it. So it was a completely organic impulse that arose from the unconscious for him. I'm imagining maybe it was something like that for you. And in a sense, you're letting the unconscious speak through your drawing. So I would say do not feel confined by the need to draw patterns or shapes or anything like that. And in terms of interpretation, I'm curious what you're thinking, Joseph, but I would say that maybe the most important thing is to have the experience of drawing the mandala and however that works on your psyche, letting that happen. But I'd like to hear what you say, Joseph.
I'm right with you on that, that there's only one indispensable form, which is the protective circle. And like everything else, whether there's axes or quadrants or colors or figures, that should arise in the way that Psyche just moves you to do it. So Jung did not prescribe designs for his patients. He wanted the image to autonomously emerge, which you had just been talking about, Lisa. So if I had to say it prescriptively, and I say this cautiously, if you're craving order, a kind of canonical order, which might be in the spirit of Tibetan use of mandalas, which are beautifully architecturally structured, of course, feel free to borrow the flaming perimeter and the lotus garland and the four gated walls or a deity at the center. Absolutely. So take on that discipline of attention. And just as Lisa was saying, notice what it does or doesn't do for you. And if your aim is more psychological self-observation, begin with a blank circle, anchor a center point, even if you want to, and then let the motifs and the colors assemble themselves. And in that way, you might experiment with drawing with the non-dominant hand and just see what it wants to do. At first, it'll feel maybe forced. Once it starts flowing, you might notice that the right and left hand have different needs to play in that space.
Here's a comment from one of our patrons named Silken. So excited for this episode. I've recently become very interested in and inspired by Hildegard von Bingen's illuminations and wonder if there is a way to touch on any of her divine works or mandalas. Thanks for all you do, longtime fan.
So it's a tricky question because it's assuming that we would know about Hildegard von Bingen's stuff. I mean, I have to say that when she kind of became well-known many years ago, it was fascinating, and her music and learning about her was an amazing thing. So I have to say that I did jump online and just looked at a couple of images because I didn't really know how to orient to this. So I want to kind of just explain that this may not be as thorough as you probably could deliver because you know her work.
Yeah.
So a couple of things that sometimes she seems to use this kind of world egg imagery, and that can also show up in this kind of artwork as an Earth disk, which is ringed by the ocean and the air and the stars and land masses. I might interpret that as a quaternity that is securing a center, and that these cosmic layers disclose the self in this microcosm, macrocosm dance. And the polarity there in her work, I might think of as matter versus spirit, or the tension between those things, that there's an infinite and also something that encircles the heavens. So the finite and the infinite are kind of dancing in that imagery. So you might play with that. Again, I don't feel like any kind of an expert. Another image I think that I came across is this idea of the quickening of the child, because the divine child is such an enormous image in Christian mythos. So sometimes there's a square that has these kind of triple bands with eyes and fiery orbs that are pouring spirit into the womb. And so it seemed like the Holy Ghost was not appearing as a dove, but appearing as a quadratus, a square that is simultaneously Trinitarian. So Jung might call that a conjunctio oppositorum, where the feminine, the earth, is receiving this descending pneuma or spirit. And that tension, I'm just shooting from the hip here, this idea of incarnation versus abstraction, feminine vessel, masculine fire, again, in very broad archetypal terms. And the last thing that I brushed against was this idea of the 6 days of creation, and that image of the concentric days flowering into the Sabbath of gold. And in that way, I think that the week becomes a kind of revolving mandala, and the 7th day is the 7th petal, and the 7th then becomes a signal of psychic wholeness. And there we have this labor versus repose, or being versus becoming. So there's a cyclic tension between those bits of it. Again, I want to apologize those of you for whom von Bingen's work is like your opus. Write to us and let us know what you think about those images, because I think there's much, much more to say than I could so quickly.
I think you did a fabulous job, and I'm just going to leave it there.
Okay.
Here's a question from Adrian. I'm going to be so interested in this. The connection of mandalas to the 4 square interests me. Years ago, I had a dream that figured a 4 corners mandala, and I had no clue what it meant, dismissed it. An extremely dangerous animal that could kill my husband was fished from its center. And a few weeks later, I made the first move to leave my abusive marriage. Imagine my shock reading Jung's Kundalini lectures years later, and he speaks word for word of 4 square mandalas and the ineffable and dangerous God that comes from their centers. I turned pure white reading this, that Jung tapped into something so universal that it entered my dreams before I even knew much about it. I would love to hear more about the universality of the mandala. What does the 4 corners mean? And why can we never understand what can be found at its center, even when it emerges to mysteriously help us in dreams to do scary things, like leaving dangerous marriages? I'm struck again with this comment on something we've noticed before, the way that these images spontaneously appear in visions, active imaginations, and dreams, especially at a time of crisis. So here was someone who was in a dangerous marriage, and she had this really remarkable dream that stayed with her. And, she says, Jung tapped into something so universal. Well, it's there. It's in the collective unconscious. And yes, I think that this image of something at its center that is transpersonal, that is ineffable, that we cannot relate to consciously. It is the deity, correct? That's what is at the center of these Tibetan mandalas that we've been referencing. And the deity can be both beneficent, but it can also be fierce and dangerous as the gods are. in fact. And here it was coming to you in a time of distress. Now, you're asking a lot about the four corners, and there is this kind of tension in many mandalas between the square and the circle. And there's this idea of the squaring of the circle. The square with its four equidistant sides does also connote wholeness, but there's a perfection to the circle. So in some sense, I think that the squared circle indicates a kind of a process of development toward wholeness and perfection.
Beautifully said. And just to toss a few things in there, there's three pieces to this. There's the containment, and that's the four-cornered structure, that kind of closed psychic circuit around a marriage that has kind of grown dangerous. Then there's the eruption and the dangerous creature that carries this raw, instinctive aggression that you needed, but you couldn't claim as your own quite yet. And then there's this exteriorization, like once it's fished out, that force then migrates from the dream symbol into a kind of waking resolve.
Yeah.
That then gave you the gas, for your engine to make a big change. And Jung noticed that quaternity mandalas often surface before a decisive rupture, that to shore us up, to make us a bit more muscular. So before a divorce, a resignation, a break with addiction, so that an image kind of briefly aligns the kind of scattered energies that we're feeling, like we're not sure, maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know. And then the center releases this stored power that then can move into action. And the few times that Jung cites his patients, they talked about this experience of a kind of harmony that then settles in after this very fierce kind of intervention. So the good news is, thank goodness, and you've got, some kind of guardian angel self that's looking out for you, and that's good news for all of us. Thank you, Connie, for sending us a little bit of a question here, and we're happy to hear from our subscriber community, so thank you so much. So Connie writes, please address the circle moving to square, that nature in mandalas. How can the self be imaged during our lifespan in the circle or the square? I'm 83, and my dreams have had increasing quaternities in images and numbers in the last several years.
That's very moving, isn't it? That Connie, that you're kind of tracking this as you, I'm sure, consider mortality. So, the interesting thing about the square is that it is the shape that can contain the circle perfectly, as it were, completely symmetrically. There's no other shape that can do that in the same way. So, there's a reason why the square is an image of wholeness, and especially that 4 is an image of wholeness. This was one of the things that Jung remarked on, and we see this again and again. In fairy tales, there are often sort of 3 attempts to do something, and then the 4th time, there's success. So there are these sort of groupings of 4 which show a kind of progressive development toward wholeness. So there's the first time, the second time, the third time, and then the 4th time. So 4 is an important number, and it does indicate wholeness. And then I think that the circle in some way is kind of the perfected square, as it were.
Absolutely. So we might toss a few associations out. The circle is spirit's native gesture. It's boundless, centripetal, it's timeless. And Jung said it's the primary image of the psyche, that just a plain old circle. The square, I think, has something to do with earth logic and weight and incarnation and it can signify body and matter and reality. And in tattva work, which is a form of Hindu mysticism, the yellow square, which is called prithvi, symbolizes earth particularly. So we have this wonderful dance that one becomes the other, one is in or around the other. So I think that there's a couple of things we could imagine. One is that as we're aging, there's a kind of life review that we go through. And when I think about the square, I think about how memory fans out in the four cardinal directions, past, present, here, and beyond. And there's a demand to orient to that. And certainly in that last quarter of our life, that's moving around. And then there's another concept, the memento finis, which is the idea of the bodily limits. And that really sharpens as we age. So there is a natural, powerful drive to complete the square. And that really intensifies. So a rotating circle can turn into a kind of steady chamber so that the self and the ego can meet in this very particular way. So we could break this into a few ideas. And again, this was not explicit in your question, but I feel like it's implied. That when we see the circle inside of the square, we can interpret that sometimes as spirit has agreed to inhabit matter. And that image is about staying attentive to bodily rhythms and relationships in your daily rituals. When the square is inside the circle, we might interpret that as the earthly tasks are nearly finished and that consciousness is widening to a kind of transpersonal horizon. If we think of fours and permutations of 4, 8, 16, to me, that's a kind of iterative, rhythmic deepening of the same theme of stabilize, integrate, sanctify, structure, structure, structure. And then sometimes the circle is rotating more and more slowly, or perhaps even stopping. And often if we're gifted with that sense, the opus is near completion. And what was dynamic is crystallizing into an enduring form, which may in some ways represent what we will take with us in consciousness as we leave the body. Jung didn't write extensively about this, but he did believe that consciousness survives in some mysterious form.
Yeah.
So I think across the lifespan that the mandala moves from a kind of roaming circle, as when we're young, to a kind of seated square. And we need that because wholeness needs to be imagined and then incarnated. And so that process might be suggested in some of the things that you're experiencing. And again, this is all highly speculative. Elizabeth, shout out to you. Thank you so much for this next question. Elizabeth writes, I have seen mandalas in yoga classes and feel pulled to them, enjoying the geometry and the colors. I feel unsure how to work with them, and I would love to know more about how to get started. Thank you.
You know, Elizabeth, what I would say is just enjoy them. Follow the impulse. If you feel moved to draw one, then do. I think what's important here is that it is a kind of spontaneous experience that you might have, that it isn't a kind of scripted activity, but that you're allowing something to happen in the unconscious. And therefore, I feel a little wary of saying, well, why don't you get yourself a mandala coloring book and, color one a day or something like that. I think it's important to kind of listen to the unconscious. The unconscious is inviting you to engage with them somehow, but it might be important to see what the unconscious wants you to do.
So that is a very Jungian perspective, and Jung was much more interested in emergent phenomena, and he was more interested in how the self, again, can create just what we need for a moment in time. I do want to lean into the fact that you're seeing these already created mandalas as part of your yoga class. And that's leaning a little more into the religious use of mandalas, which are often more prescribed. So there are two ways that in a religious practice, mandalas are used. One is for a contemplative focus, and that's often the yantra. And so you might see, you may have seen these where there's a series of triangles, innumerable triangles that are moving in or moving out. And that is kind of a way of training consciousness and concentration. So in that way of kind of fixing on the mandala and allowing one's perfection of concentration to work, and the Tibetans believe that the yogini can find this absolute state where all opposites are transcended through perfect concentration. Again, you'd need to go to a tradition outside of Jung because he didn't use them that way. The other way that mantras are used, which is particularly Tibetan, is that the inherited mandala, which has been kind of bestowed through the tradition, that it's studied. There's a lot of learning and doctrine and things called empowerments, so that there's learning about it. And then as an advanced technique, something similar to active imagination, where people would imagine literally shrinking down and entering into the mandala and having these encounters, many of which have been prescribed, that you're going to turn right and then you'll see this deity and maybe you'll say this mantra. So there's a very specific imaginal encounter that can happen through the mandala. And I guess what I would just encourage you to do, if your yoga class or your yoga teacher is highly knowledgeable about this, have a conversation. But again, Jung undoubtedly studied those kinds of things and he knew about them, but he was more interested in this spontaneous use, either through art or other ways.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.